So our friend and colleague Yuliya Kovaliv, ambassador of our country to Canada.
I wanted to welcome everybody to this conversation, which was scheduled between myself and Madam Ambassador, but we were blessed to have more visitors from Ukraine and being added to the delegation. We were handling the media last minute. We were also testing your patience. So thank you for accommodating that sort of ad hoc change, which we had to deal with. And thank you also to Mr. Petrai taking on and connecting the delegation from Ukraine with our academic community here. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Andrea Kovaliv, Assistant Director of Operations at CIUS, who was handling and organizing and managing this magic event. So
thank you.
It goes back to you.
Well, I just want to get us started here, and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and in Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. For thousands of years, this has been the home and gathering place of treaty signatories, the Cree, Nakota Sioux, Stoney, Saulteaux, the Cree Iroquois, and of other Indigenous peoples, including the Blackfoot, Dene, and Métis. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and to honor those who signed the treaties with the intent that we live alongside one another harmoniously. We recognize that all Albertans are treaty people and have a responsibility to be aware of our shared history and to understand the spirit of Treaty 6 so that we can create a just future built on peace and friendship. This acknowledgement is meaningful to me as I think about all the many waves of Ukrainians who have immigrated to Canada. I am here as a result of my grandparents and my father surviving World War II and finding their way to Edmonton. And long before them, our early Ukrainian pioneers were given the opportunity to build a new life for themselves on this land. We have stories about the generosity our pioneers received from Indigenous peoples who shared their skills, their knowledge of this land, and to help the people survive. I'm hopeful we will create new stories of collaboration, and I am grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land, to learn more about our individual and shared histories. And I'm especially grateful to the people whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enhance our community. And I think this speaks a lot to our work set before us today. So welcome to everyone. We are honored to have with us the Ukrainian Ambassador to Canada, Yuliya Kovaliv, along with General Consul Alexander Danileko, and guests from Ukraine, members of Parliament and Chairman of the Committee of Humanitarian and Information Policy, Mr. Nikita Poturayev, Deputy Chairman and Committee on Humanitarian Information Policy, Ms. Yevgenia Kravchuk, and Ms. Irina Herashchenko. Vitaємо вас всіх. As our time today is brief and now even briefer, let me simply set the stage. Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen, Director of CIUS, will lead us in conversation with Ambassador Kovaliv about Ukraine today, the impact of Russia's genocidal war on Ukraine, Ukraine's current needs, and what our roles and responsibilities might look like in support of this fight for global democracy. I will share just a few things. We are being recorded and live streamed via YouTube and Zoom, so I want to welcome all of our guests that are watching. We will have brief time at the end for some questions from around the table, as well as we'll try to take some from Zoom as well. If anyone listening on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll do our very best to address them. And with that, let's begin. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, for launching our conversation with Madam Ambassador live and on Zoom and YouTube channels, but most importantly for all of us gathered in this room. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Madam Ambassador, and esteemed guests from Ukraine and our campus community to this conversation. I think I'd like to start first with a bit of the background information for those of you who may not be very familiar with what we have been doing at the University of Alberta and at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies since February 24th, 2022. As you know, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is one of the oldest institutions of its kind in the world. We were founded in 1976 with the assistance, help, and the vision of the community to build the anchor center for the world to pursue Ukrainian studies internationally, nationally, and locally as well. We have a mandate to study Ukraine and Ukrainians in their connections to the world, and we are very much committed to this mission and vision of ours. Since last winter, together with our university partners, we've teamed up and began focusing on a number of initiatives which were positioned to be as a response, a rapid response, or otherwise an academic response to the assault on the global democracy and human rights, the battle which is now being fought on the territory of Ukraine. And in particular, I wanted to bring everybody's attention that we are actually one of the largest, in fact, largest funding agency when it comes down to supporting scholarship, academic communities, partnerships, institutions around the world. We are able to put aside and support that work with about $500,000 Canadian funds a year, give it to take on an average every year. And certainly we have increased this support over the course of last year and a half. We, together with our campus partners, I see you in the room, thank you for joining us today. We have funded and launched the Displaced or Disrupted Ukrainian Students and Scholars Initiative. We lovingly call it DAS. We had put aside $600,000 early on last spring, and we've been working and have been successful at locating further funding to support those students and scholars who were able to flee and those who weren't. We have been able to support close to 50 individuals thus far, and we still have the statistics growing. In addition to that initiative, you probably would be also aware or not that we've also been supporting digitally the scholarships and digital collections of those individuals who felt desperate need of storing and saving their data somewhere on a safe server. So we've been also working along those lines. Importantly, our university was the first and well-recognized as such a leader in Canada amongst other peers in its group on waiving tuition fees to the incoming students from Ukraine. We have again been very lucky to receive hundreds of applications. Numbers are growing, and currently I think we're beyond about 80 scholars and young scholars who are currently students coming and joining university as students. Also, in addition to that, at the Research Institute, we launched a number of very important initiatives as academics, historians, political scientists. I'm very pleased to look at my colleague, Alexander Pankeev, who's been relentless in his work on building and strengthening our Forum for Ukrainian Studies, Canada's leading analytical platform when it comes down to reflecting, profiling, documenting the academic and otherwise policy expertise on Ukraine and the geopolitical global crisis we're all currently in. I am comparing us to perhaps Atlantic Council. I think we'll be ahead of them maybe very soon as well. And looking at Alexander, he is unstoppable. So thank you for all this work. We also have spent and continue to spend in our energies, time, resources on actively leading the efforts in decolonizing Eastern European studies, Slavic studies in the world. We do this work in Canada. That's actually not as difficult as it might be elsewhere. We do this work with colleagues in the United States. Importantly, we do this work with our European partners. We're focusing now, refocusing in this direction also to work with our Latin American partners, because we have academic expertise in these areas of studies. And again, my colleague Serge Sipko is probably in the room somewhere here as well, who is responsible for the Diaspora Studies Initiative in the Institute, with main focus on collaborating and partnering with Latin American countries altogether. So we do work also with partners in Ukraine, and given the immense support we've been receiving from the community and our financial partners, we were able to initiate, and we're currently negotiating a project focusing on the documentation of the ecocide, which had been caused by the Kakhovka Dam. We're working with our partners in Ukraine on addressing desperate needs and documenting and analyzing the effects which this disaster and other disasters has caused to the river systems of Ukraine. We call it Dnipro project at this particular moment. We're happy to talk about that later. And of course, we actively assist the global scholarly community in gathering and disseminating war testimonies with our methodological workshops, which have been held in Europe, but also in Canada, with our summer institutes, which attracts researchers and war testimony documentarians. And also in Canada, we've started and launched our own project documenting war testimonies here through our interviewing process. This is a bit of a context in which we have been operating, Madam Ambassador, and I'm looking forward to a couple of questions and obviously your answers towards those. And I'm switching exactly to those right now. Good several weeks ago, Ukrainian forces, but also Ukraine together, have engaged with carefully calculated offensive initiatives on the front line. And it gives the global community now an opportunity to not just simply reflect an ongoing military needs, but also to focus on what Ukraine might need coming out of that war. What are those directions that the country will be undertaking? So colleagues of ours, academics, policymakers, members of business community here in Canada and internationally, I know they're turning their eyes and they're looking into that. So can you give us a brief overview of what Ukraine has been already doing with the focus on its future reconstruction?
Thank you for that question, and I probably will start saying that it's my big pleasure and honor to be with you today, to be in Alberta, in Edmonton, and also in the Institute. Since I arrived to Canada as ambassador, I heard a lot and I saw a lot of the work of the Institute and a lot of researchers, and that was built up for many things, support and political decisions that our partners are now doing, because it's very important that now, as Ukrainians are bravely fighting in the front line against Russian aggressor, against Russian terrorism, fighting with the Russian genocidal war, having this united support of Canada, US, UK, EU, and over 45, 50 countries, but I would say the figures are much more. If we look on United Nations resolutions, we have 146, 143 countries who are supporting the resolutions that recognize the illegal invasion of Russia. And a lot of these things are also done with a strong voice of academia. And I would like to thank you for many years of strong advocacy, strong research, many decades. And the Institute was started far before Ukraine got its independence. And a lot of those things that Institute promoted helped Ukraine not only to become an independent state, not only that Canada was among really the first countries and actually the first Western country to recognize Ukraine as an independent state, which we as Ukrainians value, remember, and that's what our bilateral history is being built, but also helping to build Ukraine as a democratic state. And I'm so happy that I'm today accompanied with our distinguished members of the parliament who are with us today in Edmonton and participating in OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, because even when in the wartime, in the time when the country, its territory, its people are under the massive attacks, Ukraine is a democratic state. All the democratic institutions are working. You see the members of the parliament who not only are doing their job in the parliament, supporting the legislation that address the war needs of the country, and that's also working on a huge new era for Ukraine, the era of European integration. That really requires a lot of work for the parliament or as of integration of all Ukrainian regulation, legislation into the EU norms. I hope the next week we have the Vilnius summit, where Ukraine not only think and only expects, but we believe is the only right decision to give a clear message finally to Ukraine on its NATO membership. And of course, for my colleagues from the parliament, it will be, and it is, another big file to work to bring Ukrainian legislation, regulation with the NATO standards. But in general, if you look on it, that Ukraine is able to maintain all the democratic institutions during this horrific war to keep resistance. That is the new Ukraine. That is really the time when we make our new history. And being here today, I want to encourage you not only look on our history, that was already a lot described with your big participation, what we value, but there is a new chapter, totally new chapter of Ukraine as a nation and Ukraine as a country. The country who has managed to unite the world in standing with Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, who managed to unite not only the political part of the countries, but the people around the world, standing with us, supporting us. It's important, and it's important that this history is being written now. And I encourage you, as we are talking about the future researches, to focus what is happening now in Ukraine as a country, as a united society, as the world support of Ukraine. That is the time when probably less and less people, if you ask them about Ukraine, will try to find where is this country is on the map. Ukraine is the country that everybody knows. Unfortunately, because of the war, but this is the right time to focus on this new history. Of course, with the support that we are getting from our partners, from all the Western world, we are fighting to deoccupy our territories, because it's not only important for us as a country to take control of our own sovereign borders. We do believe that it's important for all the Western world that the rule-based order will be restored, meaning that Ukraine will restore its sovereign borders. Because we saw the concessions in 2014 and 15 with the Minsk agreement and the ideas of some ceasefire. It does not work. It does not work with Putin. It does not work with any other dictator. On the contrary, he could use it as a time to regroup, to produce more weapons, and to go further. I think that there were many mistakes, including the reaction when Russia invaded Georgia and occupied part of our territory, when Russia illegally occupied Crimea and our Donetsk and Luhansk region, many Russian atrocities in Syria. Only now many more world leaders and people around the world understand that only full Ukrainian victory and the restoration of all our sovereign borders that would put the end of the historical, centuries-long ambitions of Russian Empire to erase Ukraine as a country, to erase Ukrainians as a nation. Because what we see and what we value in terms of the political support we have here in Canada, Canadian Parliament already recognized that the Russian war against Ukraine is the genocide of Ukrainian people. I'm very grateful for all of your studies and research for Holodomor. And I'm very grateful that Canada was among the first countries to recognize Holodomor as a genocide against Ukrainian people. But what is happening now in Ukraine, and especially in the occupied territories, is the genocide. And we are now actively working on bringing Russia to justice, not only for the crime of aggression, war crimes, but the genocide as well. Because if we see on all of the Russian attempts to erase Ukrainian culture, illegal Russian passportization, illegal moving Ukrainian children from Ukrainian territories to Russia, and illegal adoption of Ukrainian children in Russian families, these all are the parts of Russian genocidal policy. Russia rewrites the history books. Russia tried to erase everything what is Ukrainian from any of school books, educational media, and Russian propaganda. And it's very important to take this chance and to be able being a part of this history. The history of what is being developed now as we see it, to be able to devote your time and devote your research efforts to document these war crimes, this act of the genocide, Russian terrorism, because we will all bring Russia to justice. We already are working on the special tribunal for the crime of aggression. You know that it was a historical case when International Criminal Court already issued a global arrest warrant for Putin and for so-called Russian children's ombudsman. And we will bring this justice, because this justice is important not only for us and those thousands of Ukrainians who died and whose relatives died and who suffered during the war. It's also a signal for other dictators in the world that these crimes cannot be committed again. And I really encourage you to put a lot of effort, because you are now a part of this history. And don't miss this chance, and don't give this chance to next generation to provide the resources of everything that was happened like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Take this chance, and it's important for us, because your role in an academia world, your role in providing as an academia the evidences is very important for us on both the diplomatic front, both in the judicial front, as we are working in with the ICC, ICJ, and a special tribunal that we will launch against Russian crimes. And this is the essential role where academia need to play. Another thing you mentioned, and we do believe it's a big thing to do, it's about reaching to the global south. Unfortunately, historically, Russia was significantly present in the countries of the global south, and they're still spreading actively their propaganda, their Russian narratives there. So your role as an academia will reaching your counterparts in Latin America and the other countries of the global south, to many of whom resonate our standing and our pain, what is happening when the country is trying to invade, erase the culture, erase the cultural historical heritage. It's a big role you can play, and we encourage you to make it as one of the priorities to help us as Ukrainian diplomats and the diplomats of our partnering countries to bring this message, and through academia as well. And that is very important. And probably finally to your question of the rebuilding. To be frank, the rebuilding has already started. The rebuilding of Ukraine started the next hour after the missile attack. When in winter, Russia was launching missiles to damage Ukrainian critical infrastructure, the idea of Putin was to demotivate Ukrainians, to deprive people of what we usually took for granted, from electricity, from heating, from clean water. Every night, the people went to the shelters, to the bomb shelters, or depriving from sleep. And what is the rebuilding? The next 2 hours after the missile attacks, we are launching firefighters, our engineers were on the spot, were repairing, and in few hours, in few days, we're able to resupply people with those basic needs. It's also the damage, the cost of damage is huge. As of the latest report of the World Bank, it's $411 billion, the cost of the damage that Russia brought to us. But it could be much more if we look on the impact of Russian war last year on the energy and food prices. On those countries, especially the emerging and low-income countries who were dependent on Ukrainian grain export, and with blockade of the Black Sea ports, Russia was depriving the ability to provide the food for millions of people, including the countries of the global south. And of course, we have a support from World Bank, international, in general, international financial institutions. Ukraine is doing a lot of their homework. This is the first ever in the history that the country which is actively fighting the war got the 4-year IMF program, which is not only a part of financing the needs and supporting Ukrainian government, which also has another pillar, which is the continuing the country of doing the needed reforms. And one of the big anchor for Ukrainian transformation and Ukrainian rebuilding is a historical decision which was done last June to grant Ukraine a status of membership to EU membership. This is historical because it will drive, and it's already driving, the transformation of Ukraine. And our EU integration is now a huge part of all the legislation. And I will also pass the floor to our MPs to brief a bit how democracy, how the parliament is working during the war. But we are not only fighting, not only helping the people with any support they need after each and every attack, but also we are continuing to transform the country. We are continuing to move on a speed for our EU integration. We do hope that next week Ukraine will finally get this very clear message about the NATO membership, because we understand that the future rebuilding and participation of the private sector in the rebuilding of Ukraine will be linked to the security of Ukraine, because it's probably fair to say that each and every private investor will have the concerns whether it's secure to put the money and to start the business in Ukraine. And of course, we believe that the strongest security guarantees for Ukraine is a NATO membership. It's needed not only as an important prerequisite for rebuilding of Ukraine, but it will increase the security of NATO itself, especially its eastern flank. And Ukraine's army, which is now among the strongest army in the world, not only technically capable, not only capable to use NATO standard weapons, but very highly motivated. These young men and women, many of them were journalists, doctors, engineers in their previous life, are now fighting in the trenches, are now giving the highest what they can give their lives to stand and to fight for the country. And so the rebuilding has started. Ukrainian business is the first to step in. Many of them relocated their facilities from the eastern regions to the western regions for the more safer places. Many foreign companies, some of them have already started their project in Ukraine. As an example, I'm usually saying, which sometimes people are surprised, but McDonald's is working in Ukraine and even expanding their chain of restaurants. Ukraine is building the new wind farms because we believe that our rebuilding will be building better, building with the technologies that will address the climate change. So the digital and IT sector is really very strong in Ukraine, and I think it's one of the big pillars of our resistance. Both the government, who was able, when Kyiv was under attack and the Russian troops were very close to Kyiv within the first days and weeks of the war, government was working, government was providing huge number of services digitally, because we are very strong in all of the digital government, and we are ready to share with Canada, with provincial governments, the really unique and very effective digital services that Ukraine during the war can provide to our people, especially because we have almost 6 million of internally displaced people. So we are depriving from any bureaucracy just to provide very quick all those needed government services to the communities. But of course, there are 5 priorities for us as the rebuilding. It's rebuilding of the energy sector, which suffered a lot, infrastructure, demining. Humanitarian demining is a huge challenge for Ukraine, and that is one of the biggest priority for the government. Military attack, because Ukraine is not only fighting the war, but Ukraine is able both to test all the new equipment and the new technologies, including UAVs, drones, and other innovative ways of warfare on the ground, and of course the production facility. As you can imagine, like rebuilding of the houses, which we have over 36,000 houses destroyed, including the big apartment buildings, it would require a lot of resources, and that will be a huge market. So if to summarize, if you look on the rebuilding of Ukraine, there will be 4 things I want you to remember. First, Ukraine's rebuilding will be too big to ignore. 411 billion makes Ukraine the biggest place of capital investments in the European continent. The second thing, what differs as of pre-war Ukraine Ukraine is already has the status of member, candidate to member of EU. So all of the regulation and the policy will be coming every day, every month, closer to EU. The third thing, there is a huge backup of international financial institutions who are helping to provide concessional financing, who are helping to provide security, insurance to the foreign investors, including covering the war risks. That's where we are focusing now. And the fourth thing is Ukraine will be EU member, Ukraine will be NATO member. So investing in Ukraine, you will invest in Europe, you will invest as one of the closest partner to Canada, and we really welcome companies not only to wait when the war ends, but be ready and start exploring the opportunities in Ukraine now, so not be too late, because the other countries are already in the ground.
And this is where I wanted to come in with the next question about particularly Canadian expertise and resources, which can be probably brought into this very important work. What would you see Canada doing? What can Canada do? How it can step up its game
In terms of
in terms of helping Ukraine to rebuild and connect?
First of all, we're very grateful for Canada helping us with one of the big priorities for us is demining. Canada is one of the biggest countries to help Ukraine with demining equipment, because over 146,000 hectares are potentially contaminated with mines, including huge number of agri-fields. So Canada has been providing for us the needed equipment for demining efforts, and also training robots for demining, and it's really valuable, both helping us to bring back life to those deoccupied communities, but also supporting our agri sector, cleaning up with the mines. The second thing is, of course, the capital. Canada has among the biggest in the world pension funds, with whom we are working together, because the investing and bringing this private capital co-financing with the other strategic investors in Ukraine will be very valuable. The third thing, where we have started a good cooperation is the energy sector. With all of these dimensions, we have now a big 10-year strategic partnership between the companies in our nuclear sector, and including the critical minerals to produce nuclear fuel. Actually, Canadian companies are helping now Ukraine to fully substitute any Russian nuclear fuel that for decades have been used on Russian-built nuclear reactors in Ukraine. Now Canadian companies are stepping in and helping us not only to diversify, but most important, to provide these security supply for all of the value chain in the nuclear sector. We are making a big focus on both the clean energy and clean technologies in the fossil fuels, where we see the big role and cooperation with Canadian companies. Of course, in Ukraine, Canada is famous for so-called Canadian houses, which everybody knows in Ukraine where it is. And of course, while rebuilding cities and communities, we welcome Canadian companies to help us to rebuild communities, to rebuild housing, and to rebuild the infrastructure. So this, I would say, the priorities we are working on.
Thank you. This is good to know the broader perspective of what Canada can do altogether. But we are gathered here on the campus of the largest and globally leading university. So let's switch our conversation and focus on universities, Canadian universities, and U of A in particular. I'm going to ask you a very direct question. What do you hope to accomplish with your visit to the University of Alberta on one hand, and how can we, at the University of Alberta, outside of Ukrainian studies, can again?
I think we've already done a good progress on it. Of course, the partnership between Ukrainian universities, and I'm happy we had the meeting with Vice President of University yesterday.
It was yesterday.
Yes, it was yesterday, yeah. And I hope it will really go into the partnership with Ukrainian University, which is keen on partnering both exchange of the students, exchange of research, exchange of the fellows, and also especially when we are talking about the carbon capture, all of the technologies that respond to the climate change for the energy sector, it's really one of the biggest priority for us as Ukraine see itself in the future, one of the biggest supply of clean energy to the European Union. So I think we already have some agreed plan on how we will do it, and I look forward that soon we will have good use on this track.
Thank you. And also, we were talking about the mutually beneficial relationships because Ukraine has immense expertise in IT sector. You were mentioning that, and in new expertise is being built around drone technology. We actually have a student who has come from Ukraine with his own project in the IT sector, who's still building and pursuing this now as a part of his educational effort here. So I can see, going forward, there might be ways of seeing that collaboration is mutually beneficial. I'm turning to Madam Chair here.
Can I a bit turn also give a floor to I'm really happy that I'm lucky to be here today with our members of the parliament. It's not so often they are coming somewhere else than Ottawa, but as Ottawa is today is not on vacation, so happy for them to be here because they're working every day on the ground in Ukraine. They have the parliamentary meetings every day, including the first days of the invasion where Russian tanks were close to Kyiv, and now I will give the floor to Evgenia Kravchuk to also.
Absolutely, please do.
Thank you. Yuliya, actually, when you just mentioned it, I remember that actually my trip to Canada was also Yuliya's first trip as ambassador, because I came to Ottawa for the first time until the 24th of February on the 1st of April. It was all women delegation. A lot of our parliament diplomacy have a very women face. We have very active members of parliament. So actually it was our first mutual project in Canada, and I'm so delighted we can continue in other places in this great country. So my name is Evgenia Kravchuk. My colleagues already had a brief introduction. I'll tell about myself. I'm in Solana Lundu fraction, which is Landry Party. My first convocation, I've been member of parliament since 2019. I was 34 when I became one. So we have a very, I would say, young age of new members of parliament that's coming closer to students and studies and everything. As Yuliya mentioned, we do have a fully operating parliament, and I've often been asked, do you live in Ukraine? Do you work where you immigrated? Of course we live in Ukraine. I remember the morning of the 24th of February, we went to the parliament. We were in the parliament at 13 minutes past 7, voting for the martial state, and now we gather at least every 2 weeks and vote for many legislation. Actually, me and Maketa were responsible for one of the legislation in media. I chaired the informational policy subcommittee, and it was one of the 7 steps we need to achieve to start negotiation process to access the European Union, and it's fully done, marked, checked. We're happy we did that. We can switch to another project. And we really hope that Ukraine will start negotiation process by the entering EU by the end of this year. So we'll wait for the political decision in December of this year to start the negotiation process. We will open always 35 chapters. Ukraine will be changing. It is changing now, and that's what I wanted to ask. That I think that Ukrainian studies should have the reflection of how Ukraine is changing. We have the whole generation of young people who already have their own kids that were born in modern Ukraine. Most of the fighters that are on the front already don't remember anything, about the Soviet Union. My daughter is 9 years old. That's how the wars, it started in 2014, we don't have to forget about it. But we have, in cultural community, we have a new generation of artists that can bring this cultural product we can be proud of to other countries. And I would like to ask you to reflect these changes in mentality, because Ukrainians for over 1,000 years were part of Europe. Now we are fully coming back to our home. And in other things, how we can cooperate. Yes, you already mentioned that the IT, green energy, the agriculture, and actually I just found in the news that Ukrainian investors are making revenue in Ukraine even now. That was the information of spring of this year. So even despite of the loss of GDP, despite of the full-scale war, Ukraine is operating. We're collecting taxes. We're paying our soldiers only with the taxes we collect. So we are interested in this investment. And probably the last but not the least, I think that everyone would ask when you want to invest, what about the judicial system, the courts and everything? That's another big part of the job we do right now. We are, I would say, in the full-fledged of this reform. We've already done we made this new concept that appoint judges. So we're moving there, and the anti-corruption infrastructure in Ukraine is much bigger than anywhere in Europe, because that's another question we'll ask. Okay, we'll give you these billions, where will they go? So we're making sure that it will be a very transparent process, and we believe that those countries who stood with Ukraine, from the very first day, should take this most significant role in the reconstruction process. And I think we can talk more about the cooperation among the universities, and then about the last thing promised, how to bring Ukraine closer to civilized world. As President Zelensky just registered legislation to make English as the special status, not the state language or anything, but to make sure that every kid since kindergarten would learn English in every school, will English, and also it will be one of the needed criteria to get into the high level position to know English. And it's very important, because when an investor comes to somewhere, not to here but to other region, they have to communicate normally with government. That's it.
So this is about the multiculturalism, and probably let me say the last word. As you started with the introductory remarks, and which really, I think there is a lot for us to learn from Canada's policy of reconciliation and the attitude towards Indigenous people. There is one more thing that I urge you also to put the attention. It's about Ukrainian Indigenous people, Crimean Tatars. They were not only deprived and forcefully deported from their native land of Crimea. Our Indigenous people are also now under the permanent threat. Some of them left Crimea, their native land, because of illegal occupation. But unfortunately, those who stayed in Crimea, they are under the permanent pressure. Not only that Russia erased their ability, cultural ability, but also they are imprisoning the most prominent Crimean Tatars, the most active in their communities. They are imprisoned. Many of them, unfortunately, died in prison. Some of them were forcefully conscripted to fight against Ukraine, against their will. So when looking on the Indigenous people of Ukraine, I think that's part of Ukrainian history needs a special attention. And because of this very wide Russian narrative that so-called Crimea is Russian historically, which is totally not true. And the history of Crimean Tatars, of our Indigenous people, totally prove that Crimea is Ukraine. And the whole Russian policy of depriving Crimean Tatars from their ability to live in their native land. Forceful departure is actually really the arguments against this Russian narrative that, you know, Crimea was somehow in their crazy minds Russian. So I would also, from the academia standpoint, would urge you to put your attention as well on that.
Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you very much for the discussion thus far. We will certainly be able to follow up on all those points later, but I think we're out of time, and I will turn to Madam Chair to
Yes.
say what's next.
We are at 11:30, but I did promise we could have a couple of questions, so we'll keep it as brief as we can. Does anyone around the table have a question? Everyone's mesmerized. Do we have anybody on Zoom?
We have
Bogdana.
You mentioned that Ukraine's borders have to be restored and that peace can come until after this has been achieved. I want to ask about going beyond that. The war began and it was clear at the beginning that the United Nations was helpless and hopeless in dealing with the aggression that Russia launched, and that was obvious for all to see. And you mentioned that there is a legal procedure now taking place about bringing Russia to account for that. But Ukraine had mentioned earlier that the United Nations needed to be reformed, and that in particular, the veto power of Russia had to be taken away. I agree with that, and I think that in the post-war order, one of the priorities of Ukraine, I think, should be working towards the reformation of the United Nations. It's in our interest to do so. It's in the interest of all of humanity, to do so. And the veto power, I think, has to be taken away from all of the great powers, but there has to be a mechanism in place that, international law experts can figure out, so that countries like the United States and Great Britain and France will be willing to do that. And that's my only sort of comment. I think that it would be nice to see Ukraine taking the lead in that sort of direction, because we've encountered aggression from Russia and we're trying to survive as a country, and I think that the world will listen to it, and I think that it's a good way as well to get countries from the global south to support Ukraine.
Actually, as it comes to the end of the war, there is a clear 10-point plan which President Zelensky first presented in G20 summit. Of course, the keystone and the core of this plan is the restoration of all Ukrainian sovereign borders, but it goes far beyond that, because the war already showed the world a lot of dimensions where the international Russia just brutally undermining all this international law, regulation and order goals, which is nuclear safety. This is first time within the last 50-70 years when during the active war, the civil nuclear power facilities are under attack. Not only Russia mined Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, but also they are permanently shelling the plant, which put at risk the nuclear safety, not only for millions of Ukrainians, but we unfortunately all witnessed Chernobyl and the horror of that when it comes to environment. And we were the ones who warned from the beginning that the war is a huge challenge to the environment. And there is the planet that cannot be extracted only Ukraine as the country where there are huge environmental changes and everybody else could talk about whatever. good environment, climate change policies and the other stuff. When Russia blown up the Kakhovka water dam, that is the huge damage to all the ecosystem, and not only for Ukraine. Nobody knows where all those landmines which Russia left on the territory, now when the water flows, nobody knows where we will find these landmines in the Black Sea, or it will go far beyond that. Food security. I've already briefly said that it's not only the matter, the blockade of the Odessa seaport, it's not only the matter for Ukraine, it's the matter for many countries who rely on supply of the food. And just imagine that this food is not coming to them. We will have there another migration crisis, we will have a huge humanitarian crisis for millions of people who will starve from famine in the 21st century because of Russia. And many other, and of course, the Russia need to pay for all these damages. That's why we value that Canada was among really the first country in the world to introduce legislation that will allow to seizure Russian sanctioned assets and to transfer it to Ukraine's rebuilding. And that's the others need to follow. And Russian sovereign assets need to be also taken. They need to be encouraged political leadership, but these assets need to be taken and as a source of Ukraine's rebuilding, because that's Russia that needs to pay for that.
Thank you. Yours.
Many countries have expelled Russian diplomats for their activities. Do you think Canada has done enough to deal with the problem in Canada with the Russian diplomats?
You know, the position of Ukraine will welcome those countries who expel Russian diplomats and decrease. And it's not only because Russia is committing the crimes, it's the country who does not respect any the diversity, any gender minorities, the country who is totally in a different way of saying that, you know, all the evidence is that Russian troops killing Ukrainians, raping Ukrainian children. That's only like Russia who is spreading all this information. And this information is as much a dangerous weapon as a tank and a missile. And sometimes it's even more dangerous because it's easy to absorb this information. And sometimes we don't have much inner power to really check this information, to work with them. And this disinformation, unfortunately, can disunite the societies and far beyond Russian borders. So I think it's an interest of the countries to decrease any diplomatic ties with Russia.
Thank you. We are very tight on time, so I thank everyone and encourage, if there are more questions, by all means, send them to the Institute and we'll do our very best to get answers and send them out to be able to be shared. We are steadfast in our commitment to support Ukraine here at the University of Alberta. We are very proud of the way all of our colleagues across the campus have rallied and supported us over the last way too long. Thank you so much for taking time with us today and for being here, and to all of you who came today in person and anyone watching on Zoom. Thank you very much, and we appreciate it, and we'll see you again soon.
Our delegation, and it's coins that were made by National Bank of Ukraine, and they are about the symbols of Ukraine, about anthem, flag, and our great trident. So I will pass it on this.
Дуже дякую. Thank you so much. Дуже дякуємо. So thank you so much.